Last week we interviewed Kurt Anderson, who authored Time Magazine's award of the Person of the Year for 2011. That person, of course, was the protester. In 2011, it seems, we've lost trust with most of the leading authorities in our world, whether they're political authorities, business authorities, moral authorities. Trust then has become not a commodity, but something in great short supply in the world. And a man who understands why trust is in short supply, and perhaps how to rebuild trust into a world dominated by protesters, is Robert Hurley. Robert is a professor at Fordham University and the author of an important new book, The Decision to Trust. Bob, welcome to TechCrunch TV.
Good to be with you, Andrew.
So, Bob, what do you make of Time Magazine's award in 2011 to the protester as the Person of the Year?
I think it's very appropriate. If you look at an interesting collection of groups, right, the Tea Party, Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, they all have one thing in common. All three of those groups have lost trust in different authorities. They're becoming immensely frustrated and troubled by that, and they're reacting.
Is this a crisis, Bob, of institutions or of the way we're thinking? Have all our institutions suddenly become corrupt? Or are we looking too closely, or perhaps more closely, at these institutions and the traditional sources of authority in our world?
That's a great question, and the accurate answer is it's a bit of both. Some of it's individual in the way we think. There's generational decline of trust. Trust has been declining in all industrialized democracies for about 30 years now. So there's a generational decline in optimism and trust, but it's also that trustworthiness has declined. So the piece that we can really change here is that low trust scores indicate good judgment, because many of these institutions have become less trustworthy, and we're realizing that. And because we realize they're not trustworthy, we withhold trust. A great example is low trust scores in Congress.
Bob, we're of course doing this interview not on Politico.com, but on TechCrunch.com. TechCrunch is both a medium which covers the crisis of trust in our business world, but it also, I think, came about because of that lack of trust. Mike Arrington, the founder, was a man who pioneered, I think, an irreverence towards traditional authorities. What has been the role of the internet, both in the crisis of trust and in ways that perhaps we can rebuild that trust in the 21st century?
It's a mixed bag. The internet enables lying more, right? The flood of information sometimes makes it more difficult to discern and sort through the truth. What's the expression? A lie can make it around the world before the truth gets its pants on. On the other hand, it can also increase transparency. There are websites that are really designed to discern the truth. But it's really, quite frankly, a mixed bag. I'm not so sure the internet has helped. Arguably, you could make an argument that it's actually hurt trust.
But the internet is in the middle of this crisis of trust in the early 21st century when it comes to financial institutions like Wall Street, when it comes to our politicians, when it comes to Tahrir Square, when it comes to Occupy Wall Street, when it comes to the riots in London.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Just like any medium, right? 24-hour news cycles. It's interesting. Like, take a look at the Netflix example, right? Netflix increased their price 60%. Their stock price almost instantly declined by about 20%, and they lost almost 1 million customers that year. So what happens is betrayal becomes viral in today's age with social media. Look at what Twitter is doing. So betrayal can become viral, and companies and institutions have to be ready to respond. And by the way you respond is, first you build up trustworthiness and you build up your reputation. And then if there is a betrayal, because companies and people are imperfect, right? So we sometimes fail. But if you do fail, you have to instantaneously respond. And so you really you almost need a crisis team and a response team around reputational repair and trustworthiness in most organizations today.
Well, Bob, I'm pleased you brought up the Netflix example. I wrote a piece on TechCrunch a couple of months ago defending Netflix because I thought that the consumer reaction against them was very unfair. They'd done a great job for several years and they made one mistake and suddenly the whole credibility, the reputation of the company was destroyed. Are all companies then in this perpetual crisis mode like Netflix, or should they be?
Well, I think, by the way, you're right about Netflix. They made a bad judgment. But if you look at the basis, and I talk about this in the book, if you're going to be a trustworthy leader today, you have to take a multi-stakeholder perspective in making major strategic decisions. Netflix failed to realize that that increase was going to be perceived as a betrayal by their customers. Now, that doesn't mean that Netflix was wrong. Technically, from a business model standpoint, they were correct. But they were insensitive to the needs of a very important stakeholder, the customer. And so that led to a perceived betrayal and then this viral reaction. So leaders today have a tremendous challenge. It is really hard to be a trustworthy leader in a fast-changing, complex world. And so they made a mistake. So I think what we have to do is we have to up our game as leaders to think about benevolence and transparency and multi-stakeholder integration of interests. These are all elements of trustworthiness that leaders have to understand if they're going to navigate today's territory.
Well, Bob, let me push back at you on that one because last week some research came out saying that Netflix, I think, was the least trusted company last year, and the two companies that polled the best were Amazon and Apple. And of course, both companies are run by authoritarian leaders, or were at least when in Apple's case, and both companies aren't transparent. Both companies are actually very murky in terms of what they do. So could it be argued that the real model for building trust in 21st century companies is Steve Jobs, who was anything but transparent, or Jeff Bezos for that matter?
Well, I think if you really peel back why those two organizations scored high in trust, they deliver on their commitments, right? Now, how you deliver on commitments varies. I mean, there's an argument to be made that some hierarchy helps you be organized and helps you be clear and helps you be focused, et cetera, which helps you make appropriate promises and deliver on those promises. So, you can be a high trust organization with authoritarian leadership or centralized leadership, really. Or you can be a high-trust company with decentralized leadership. But at the end of the day, you have to be careful about what you promise, and then you have to deliver on those promises consistently. That's really what builds organizational trust.
That's a very interesting observation, Bob. We have a large audience of startup entrepreneurs who are notorious for overpromising, perhaps their customers and their investors. Are you saying then even to a startup entrepreneur that you can never overpromise, that it will always come back to bite you?
That's a great question. There is actually research that shows that entrepreneurs will tend to exaggerate, perhaps even lie, to gain credibility, right? So the story about this is HP, with their first product, they didn't name it number 1. They named it 100 or something, right? To create an impression that they'd been around a while. I think aspirational communication is okay, certainly if you believe it to be true, but when you exaggerate, when you overpromise and underdeliver, you erode confidence. So the advice I would give to entrepreneurs is dream big, but always try and over-deliver on your promises. That's what your investors are going to want. And by the way, that's what your customer is going to want at some point. Now, it may take you a while before you can develop an organization to do that, but always keep that in mind.
Bob, the two words that continually come up in our innovative business world are trust and reputation. Why are these two words so central? And are they really dealing with the same thing?
That's a great question. So I think they're slightly different. Reputation is the image I have about a person. And an element of reputation can be trust and trustworthiness. But it's interesting. One of the reasons why trust is so important is you really can't have speed and collaboration without trust. Think about how you follow someone who you don't trust. Very slowly, very carefully. So if you want collaboration, innovation, and speed, you have to build trust in your organization and in your teams.
Bob, final question. Would it be fair to say, do you think, that we're living now in what some people are calling a trust economy or a reputational economy?
I'm not sure what that really means.
Well, nor do I. That's why I'm asking you.
Yeah,
You're the expert.
To me, I think trust is essential. I think people are need to get more sophisticated and clearer about how to discern trustworthiness, and that will create competitive advantage. That will increase market share, create customer preference, and employee loyalty. All right, you can't exist long term and be a world-class company without trust. Your customers are going to defect, and your employees are going to defect. So I don't think so much about reputation. I think about trust and trustworthiness. Sometimes reputations are sometimes built on sand, on image that's really not warranted.
Well, on that trustworthy note, Robert Hurley, professor at Fordham University and the author of Decision to Trust, thank you so much for appearing on TechCrunch TV.
It's great to be with you, Andrew.